Let's journey back through time. Our story doesn't begin among the gleaming marble columns of a triumphant empire. Instead, it starts in a small collection of mud huts huddled on the banks of the Tiber River. Picture the cool air and the smell of wood smoke from a few hundred small huts. This is where our story begins, in the quiet, stubborn determination of a small city that would one day rule the known world. For now, forget the cinematic legions and marble monuments. The Rome that grew into a giant was born in mud, smoke, and survival. Tonight, we'll trace the rise of the Roman Empire from these humble beginnings to its unstoppable ascent. Before we begin, thank you for being here. It's great to know there are others out there ready to travel back through the centuries. If you feel like it, you can comment below with where you're listening from. It's always a wonder to see how far our community reaches. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. A city born of myth and mud. The Tiber River winds its way down from the Apennine Mountains, carrying the stories of the hills it has touched. Long before Rome was a republic, let alone an empire, it was a place of myth. The Romans themselves, in their later glory, told a story to make sense of their own unlikely beginning. They spoke of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, sons of the god Mars, who were cast out as infants and left to the mercy of the river. The story goes that the basket carrying the two babies washed ashore where a she-wolf found and nursed them. This story of divine favor and brutal origins became a way for a powerful people to explain their destiny, but the reality was likely far more humble. While legend places Rome's founding at 753 BCE, archaeology suggests the real story began even earlier. The grand city of Rome likely started as a cluster of small villages in the famous Seven Hills. Perhaps as early as 1000 BCE, these were simple people in thatched huts, their lives governed by the seasons and a constant threat of their neighbors. Their world was no larger than the horizon of the Italian hills, and yet their location gave them a distinct advantage. They stood at a crossroads for trade, influenced by the advanced Etruscan civilization to their north and the Greek colonies to their south. These neighbors brought new ideas, the alphabet, coinage, and new ways of building and governing. For a time, Rome was ruled by kings, many of whom were Etruscan. It was under these kings that the city began to take shape. The marshy lowlands between the hills were drained, creating the space that would become the Roman Forum, the very heart of the city. Walls were built, and a single city began to emerge from the scattered villages. The legends say that the last king, Tarquinius Superbes, or Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant. The crimes of his son sparked a rebellion, and in the year 509 BCE, the monarchy was overthrown. The Romans vowed they would never again be ruled by a king. In its place, they created something new, a republic. Power would be shared, held by two consuls elected for just 1 year, each with the power to veto the other. It was a system designed to keep any one person from becoming too powerful a principle, born from bitter experience. This wasn't just a political change, it was the forging of an identity. Rome was now a state built on laws, shared duty, and a suspicion of kings that would echo for centuries. Chapter 2. The Forging of a Republic. The early republic was a time of constant struggle. Rome wasn't born great. It fought for every inch of its territory. Surrounded by enemies, the young republic battled for its very survival. The Latin War, which ended in 338 BCE, was a crucial test. After defeating their former allies, Rome did something remarkable. Instead of simply crushing them, it offered a form of citizenship, a stake in Rome's growing power. In exchange for soldiers and loyalty, these conquered peoples became part of the Roman system. Its formula, conquer, then incorporate, would become the engine of Roman expansion. The wars against the Samnites, a fierce mountain people, lasted for more than half a century. By 290 BCE, Rome had secured its dominance over most of the Italian peninsula. Its legions, once a simple citizen militia, were becoming a disciplined and adaptable fighting force. They learned to fight in smaller, more flexible units called maniples, a tactical innovation that gave them an edge on the rugged Italian terrain. With Italy under its control, Rome's gaze turned outward across the sea, and there it met its greatest rival, Carthage. Located in modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a vast maritime empire, trading powerhouse that controlled the western Mediterranean. A clash was inevitable. It came in 264 BCE over control of the island of Sicily. This was the beginning of the Punic Wars, a series of 3 conflicts that would become the ancient world's equivalent of a world war. The First Punic War was mostly a naval conflict. Rome, a land-based power, had to build a navy from scratch. It did so with characteristic determination, reverse engineering a captured Carthaginian ship. After more than 20 years of brutal fighting, Rome was victorious, gaining its first overseas province in Sicily. But the rivalry was far from over. The Second Punic War is the most famous, thanks almost entirely to one man, Hannibal Barca. In 218 BCE, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He led his army, complete with war elephants, on a perilous journey from Spain over the snow-covered Alps and into Italy itself. For years, he inflicted one crushing defeat after another on the Romans. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE was a catastrophe for Rome, a disaster where tens of thousands of its soldiers were lost in a single day. Any other state would have surrendered, but Rome did not. It refused to negotiate, raised new armies, and through sheer stubbornness, it endured. The Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, developed a new strategy. He avoided engaging Hannibal directly in Italy, and instead took the war to Carthaginian territory, first in Spain and then in North Africa. Hannibal was finally recalled to defend his homeland. The two great generals met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's tactics, had a plan for the war elephants. He ordered his men to create lanes in their formations, letting the charging beasts run harmlessly through the gaps. The result was a decisive Roman victory. Carthage was defeated, its empire broken. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Chapter 3: The Price of Power in the Fall of the Republic. The defeat of Carthage set Rome on a path of relentless expansion. With no real rival left in the West, Rome's legions turned east. One by one, the kingdoms of Greece and the Near East fell under Roman influence. The Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE saw the crushing defeat of the Macedonian king, effectively ending Macedonian independence. Soon, provinces were established in Greece, Asia Minor, and Syria. The wealth of the East, gold, art, slaves, and grain, poured into Rome, changing the city and its society forever. But this rapid expansion came at a price. The Republic's government, designed for a small city-state, started to crack under the strain of running a vast, multicultural empire. The immense wealth flowing into Rome widened the gap between the ultra-rich and the desperately poor. Small farmers, the traditional backbone of the army, were driven off their land by wealthy aristocrats who created massive plantations worked by enslaved people. These displaced citizens flocked to Rome, creating a huge, volatile, urban population. The late Republic became a time of social unrest and political violence. Reformers like the Gracchus brothers tried to solve the land crisis in the late 2nd century BCE, but they were met with violence and ultimately killed. Politics became a battlefield for ambitious generals who, with the loyalty of their professional armies, saw the state itself as a prize to be won. The old system of shared, limited power was breaking down. This turmoil led to a series of brutal civil wars. But the conflict between Julius Caesar and his rival, Pompey the Great, was the turning point. Caesar, a brilliant and ambitious general, had conquered Gaul for Rome, pushing its borders to the Atlantic. When the Senate fearing his power, ordered him to disband his army. He made a fateful choice. In 49 BCE, he led his legions across the Rubicon River, the legal boundary of Italy, effectively declaring war on his own country. Caesar's victory over Pompey left him the sole master of Rome. He was made dictator for life. And though he never called himself a king, he held the power of one. Many senators feared he would destroy the Republic for good. On the Ides of March, in 44 BCE, a group of senators assassinated him in the Senate House, believing they were saving the Republic. Their actions did the opposite. The assassination plunged Rome into another round of bloody civil wars. Out of this chaos, two figures emerged: Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, and his most trusted general, Mark Antony. For a while, they shared power, but their alliance soon crumbled into rivalry. The final showdown came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's forces, led by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, defeated the combined fleets of Antony and his ally, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. The victory was absolute. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where they would both take their own lives. With their deaths, Octavian was left as the unchallenged ruler of the Roman world. The Roman Republic, after nearly 500 years, was dead. A new era was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Empire and its Unstoppable Machine. After his victory, Octavian masterfully secured his power. He knew that Romans still hated the idea of a king, so he carefully avoided the title. In 27 BCE, the Senate gave him a new one, Augustus, meaning the revered one. He presented himself not as a monarch, but as the princeps, or first citizen, the man who had restored the Republic. This was a clever fiction. While old institutions like the Senate still met, all real power was now in his hands. The Roman Empire had begun. What followed was 2 centuries of relative peace and stability, known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This was the empire's golden age, a time when its power and influence were at their absolute peak. What held this vast empire together wasn't just its legions, but the genius of its engineers. Roman engineering was a monument to their pragmatic, relentless pursuit of order and control. Perhaps their most famous achievement was their network of roads. The Romans built over 400,000 kilometers of roads. It's a system that connected the farthest corners of the empire, from the shores of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. These weren't simple dirt tracks. Roman roads were sophisticated, multi-layered constructions with a foundation of stone, a layer of gravel for drainage, and topped with carefully fitted paving stones. They were built to last, and parts of them can still be seen today. Their main purpose was military, allowing legions to march at incredible speeds, but they also became the arteries of commerce and communication, binding the empire's diverse peoples together. Just as roads carried armies, aqueducts carried the lifeblood of the city's water. Roman engineers mastered the art and the principles of gravity to build monumental aqueducts that stretched for miles, carrying fresh water from distant springs into sprawling cities. These structures, some still standing today, allowed cities like Rome to support over 1 million people, providing water for public baths, fountains, and private homes. This incredible construction was made possible by another Roman innovation: concrete. Roman concrete, especially a type made with volcanic ash called pozzolana, was incredibly strong, durable, and could even set underwater. This revolutionary material let them build on a scale never seen before. It gave us massive structures like the Colosseum, with seating for over 50,000 spectators, and the Pantheon, whose breathtaking, unsupported dome is still a marvel of engineering. From bridges that spanned mighty rivers to complex sewer systems that kept their cities clean, Roman engineering was the framework upon which the empire was built. Chapter 5: The Edges of the World. Under the emperors, the expansion continued. The borders of the empire were pushed to what the Romans considered the edges of the known world. In 43 CE, Emperor Claudius launched a successful invasion of Britain, a mysterious island on the fringe of the map. It wasn't an easy conquest, but Roman control was brutally solidified after the Battle of Watling Street in 61 CE there. The Roman governor, despite being vastly outnumbered, crushed the rebellion of the Celtic queen Boudica, securing the province for centuries. The empire reached its absolute greatest size under the Emperor Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 CE. Trajan was a soldier emperor with boundless ambition. He waged two major wars against the powerful kingdom of Dacia in modern-day Romania. The Dacian Wars were hard-fought, but ended in a complete Roman victory. Dacia was annexed, and its rich gold mines flooded the Roman treasury, funding massive building projects back home. The story of this conquest is famously depicted on the spiraling reliefs of Trajan's Column, which still stands in Rome. Trajan didn't stop there. He pushed eastward, campaigning against the Parthian Empire and adding Mesopotamia to Rome's vast holdings. For a brief moment, the Roman Empire stretched from the cold mists of northern Britain to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. It spanned over 5 million square kilometers and was home to nearly a quarter of the world's population. It was possible to travel from one end of it to the other and never leave Roman territory. After Trajan, his successor, Hadrian, took a more defensive view. He believed the empire had grown as large as it could, and he focused on securing its borders. He's most famous for building Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain's massive fortification of stone and earth that marked the northernmost frontier of the Roman world. It was a powerful statement, a line drawn on the map to separate the Roman world from the barbarians beyond. Our story for tonight comes to a close here, at the peak of Roman power. The small city on the Tiber, born of mud and myth, had fulfilled a destiny grander than any of its founders could have imagined. It had conquered the known world through the resilience of its republic and the might of its legions. It then remade that world with its laws, language, concrete, and stone. For a time, it seemed the order Rome had created might last forever. The story of its long, slow decline is a tale for another night. For now, let's leave our minds on the image of this vast empire at its height, world bound together by roads, governed by a single authority, at peace under the watchful eye of the Roman eagle. The smoke from the early hearths has given way to the glow of 1,000,000 oil lamps across 1,000 cities. The work of survival has become the steady pulse of an empire in its prime. How does an empire that ruled a quarter of the world's population, an empire that gave us laws, languages, and our idea of civilization, just vanish? For 500 years, Rome was the master of the known world. From the highlands of Britain to the sands of Mesopotamia, all roads led to Rome. Its legions were invincible. Its engineering was a marvel, and its culture was the standard for everyone else. The Romans built monuments to last forever, convinced their empire, the Imperium Romanum, would be eternal. They truly believed their dominion was a divinely ordained, permanent reality. They were wrong. This is the story of how the greatest empire in history was brought to its knees. It's not a story of one single, catastrophic event, but a slow, grinding unraveling. It's a tale of a perfect storm, where decades of internal decay met a rising tide of external threats. It's a chronicle of economic turmoil that hollowed out its core, political instability that paralyzed its leadership, and shocking invasions that tore it limb from limb. We're going to journey back to witness the unraveling of a superpower, to understand the complex web of failures that led to the fall, and to see how the work of giants crumbled into dust. Chapter 1. The Rot Within. Before the first so-called barbarian ever set foot in Rome with hostile intent, the empire was already bleeding out from within. The lifeblood of this vast organism was its economy, and for centuries, it was a marvel. The same engine that funded the legions and built the Colosseum eventually sputtered, choked, and died, creating the conditions for catastrophe. The problem started with something that sounds surprisingly modern: currency, debasement, and hyperinflation. In the empire's glory days, the main silver coin, the denarius, was a staple currency, containing around 4 grams of nearly pure silver. It was the dollar of its day, trusted from Britain to India. But running an empire is expensive. It's a huge bureaucracy, endless public works, and above all, a colossal military. All demanded a constant river of cash. When the empire stopped expanding, the flow of new wealth from conquered lands dried up. The expenses, however, did not. Emperors, desperate to pay their soldiers, had a choice: raise taxes to politically dangerous levels or find another way. They chose the latter, and their solution was deceptively simple. They started to cheat. The process was called debasement. Imperial mints began mixing the silver in the denarius with cheaper metals like copper. At first, it was a small, barely noticeable change, but once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. Each emperor, facing his own crisis, debased the currency further. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, the silver content of Roman coins had dropped to around 75%. A century later, during the chaos of the 3rd century, it plummeted to a mere 5%, and eventually, some coins were little more than bronze with a thin silver wash to fool the public. The consequences were catastrophic. The government could mint more coins to pay its soldiers, but it was phantom wealth. People weren't stupid. They quickly realized the new coins weren't worth the same as the old ones. This led to a complete loss of faith in the currency. Imagine going to a store and the merchant refusing your money or demanding 10 times the price from a week ago. That was the reality in the late Roman Empire. Hyperinflation ran rampant. Prices for everyday goods soared, and the savings of ordinary citizens evaporated. Soldiers, paid in increasingly worthless coins, demanded higher salaries, which only forced the government to debase the currency even more. A vicious, inescapable cycle. Trade, the circulatory system of the empire, began to seize up. Why would a merchant in Egypt risk a dangerous sea voyage to sell grain in Italy if the money he received would be worthless by the time he got home? The vast interconnected trade network of the Pax Romana started to break down. Commerce withered, replaced by local barter. This was a dark foreshadowing of the feudal age to come. To make matters worse, the state's response wasn't reform, but extraction. The tax system became predatory. With the currency in chaos, the government increasingly demanded taxes in kind, in the form of goods like grain or livestock. This placed an unbearable burden on the small farmers. Many were taxed so heavily they were forced to abandon their land and flee, becoming bandits or seeking protection from powerful local lords. The empire's tax base shrank, even as its financial needs grew. This created a hollowed-out society, a fabulously wealthy elite who could often evade taxes, and an impoverished mass of peasants with nothing. On top of all this, the empire relied on an enormously expensive military that produced nothing. To pay the troops, emperors squeezed the provinces dry, disrupting the very economic activity needed to generate revenue. This reliance on an expensive military led to another fatal decision: hiring cheaper, barbarian mercenaries to fill the ranks. It was a quick fix that would have devastating long-term consequences. The economic engine of Rome sputtered. The wealth was gone, the currency was a joke, trade routes were fractured, and the people were either destitute or defiant. This was the crumbling foundation on which the political and military crises would be built. The House of Rome was rotting from the inside out. Chapter 2: The Throne of Swords. While the Roman economy spiraled into chaos, the political heart of the empire was suffering its own crisis. The story of Rome's fall is also a story of a catastrophic failure of leadership. The stable, orderly succession of the Golden Age gave way to a bloody, cruel cycle of assassination, civil war, and paralysis. The imperial throne became less a seat of power and more a death sentence. The first great tremor was the period known as the crisis of the 3rd century. It began, fittingly, with the murder of an emperor. In 235 AD, Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated by his own troops. His death unleashed 50 years of near-total anarchy. In the half-century that followed, at least 26 men claimed the title of emperor, not counting the dozens of failed usurpers. Most were generals, proclaimed emperor by their legions, who then had to march on Rome to legitimize their claim through violence. During one horrific year, 238 AD, 6 different men held the title of emperor, and all of them died violently. This military anarchy had devastating consequences. With emperors rising and falling continuously, there could be no long-term strategy. The empire's leadership was consumed with fighting itself. Roman legions, which should have been defending the frontiers, were instead turned inward, slaughtering each other in civil wars. This left the borders dangerously exposed. For a time, the empire itself shattered into 3 competing states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the Central Roman state in the middle. It was a complete breakdown of central authority. The very nature of imperial power changed. The Praetorian Guard, once the emperor's elite bodyguards, became corrupt kingmakers, assassinating emperors and auctioning off the throne. The army no longer served the state. The state existed to serve the army. An emperor's survival depended not on his skill or the love of his people, but solely on his ability to keep his soldiers paid, an almost impossible task in a collapsing economy. Out of this chaos, a strong man emerged who would change the empire forever. Diocletian, taking the throne in 284, he recognized that the empire was simply too large and beset by too many crises for one man to rule. His solution was radical. In 293 AD, he established the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He divided the empire into an eastern and a western half, each ruled by a senior emperor assisted by a junior emperor. The idea was to create a more responsive and stable system. For a time, it worked. The Tetrarchy ended the crisis and restored a measure of stability. But the system relied entirely on the goodwill of 4 powerful men, underestimating the raw ambition of the Romans. The moment Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, the system fractured and the empire plunged back into civil war. These wars were eventually won by Constantine the Great. By 324 AD, he had reunited the entire empire. But he made a decision that, while logical at the time, would seal the fate of the West. In 330 AD, he officially moved the capital of the empire from Rome to a new city on the site of ancient Byzantium, Constantinople. It was a strategic masterstroke, perfectly positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. The East had always been the wealthier half. Moving the capital simply acknowledged the fact. But for old Rome and the entire western half, it was a devastating blow. The center of gravity shifted eastward. Wealth, talent, and resources were drained from the west to build the magnificent new capital. The west became a poorer, less populated, and more vulnerable appendage. After the death of Emperor Theodosius I in 395 AD, the empire was formally and permanently divided between his 2 sons. His son, Arcadius, ruled the east, while his 10-year-old son, Honorius, became emperor of the west. This final division created 2 distinct empires, with 2 governments and 2 armies who increasingly saw each other not as partners, but as rivals. The Western Roman Empire was now on its own, and it was led by a succession of weak, inept, and often child emperors. Honorius, who reigned for nearly 30 years, was a perfect example of puppet ruler controlled by his generals. His court in the defensible city of Ravenna was a snake pit of intrigue. In 408 AD, in a fit of paranoia, Honorius approved the execution of his most capable general, Stilicho. Stilicho, a man of Vandal heritage, had repeatedly defeated barbarian incursions. His execution was an act of political suicide. It decapitated the Western military command just as the greatest threat was gathering at its borders. The political rot had reached its final stage. A divided, poorly led, and broken Western Empire now stood utterly defenseless, waiting for the final push. We are tracing the threads of an empire unraveling, a story that has been told for centuries, yet continues to fascinate and teach us. If you're finding this journey through the twilight of Rome compelling, take a moment to support the channel. Hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you don't miss the epic conclusion to this story. Your support makes this kind of historical storytelling possible. Now, let's return to the frontiers of a dying empire where the final act is about to begin. Chapter 3: The Breaking of the Eagles. The economic and political decay of the Western Roman Empire created a power vacuum. And vacuums in history are never empty for long. For centuries, Rome had been the predator. Now, weakened, Rome became the prey. The final pillar of its collapse was a series of massive, violent incursions by barbarian peoples, culminating in the unthinkable, the sacking of the city of Rome itself. The term barbarian was a Roman one for anyone who wasn't Roman or Greek, but the reality was more complex. The peoples on Rome's borders, Goths, Vandals, Franks, had been in contact with the empire for hundreds of years. They traded with Rome and served in its armies. What set the final crisis in motion was the arrival of a new, terrifying force from the Eurasian steppe, the Huns. Around 370 AD, these nomadic warriors swept into Eastern Europe, creating a domino effect. Fleeing the Huns, entire nations were pushed against Rome's borders. In 376, a large group of Goths appeared on the banks of the Danube, begging Emperor Valens to let them cross and settle as refugees. Valens agreed, seeing potential army recruits, but the plan was horribly mismanaged. Corrupt Roman officials exploited the refugees, driving a desperate people to rebellion. The conflict came to a head in August of 378, near the city of Adrianople. Valens, eager for glory, launched a reckless attack on the Gothic camp. The result was one of the most disastrous defeats in Roman history. The Gothic cavalry returned unexpectedly, smashed into the Roman flank, and annihilated Valens' army. As many as 20,000 Roman soldiers, a huge portion of the Eastern army, were wiped out. Emperor Valens himself was killed, his body never found. Adrianople was more than a battle. It was a psychological earthquake. It shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. It proved a barbarian army could destroy a major imperial force and kill an emperor on the field. A new precedent was set. The Goths were allowed to settle within the empire as a semi-autonomous nation. It was the beginning of the end for Roman control over its own territory. The main protagonist of the next chapter was a Goth named Alaric. Enraged by broken promises from the imperial court, Alaric led his Visigoths on a rampage, first through Greece and then into Italy itself. For years, he was held at bay by the brilliant General Stilicho. But as we know, Emperor Honorius had Stilicho executed in 408, with Rome's best defender gone. The path was clear. Alaric didn't necessarily want to destroy the empire, but to carve out a place for his people within it, grabbing land, gold, and a title for himself, while Honorius, safe in Ravenna, refused to negotiate in good faith. Alaric besieged Rome 3 times. The first 2 times, he was bought off. But after the 3rd siege, his patience ran out. On August 24th for 10, someone inside the city opened the Salarian Gate, and the Visigoths poured in. For the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy. For 3 days, Alaric's men plundered the ancient capital. The sack was relatively restrained. Alaric, a Christian, ordered his men to spare the main churches. But the psychological damage was immense. News of the sack sent shockwaves across the world, to both Romans and barbarians. It was a symbol that the Western Empire was broken. If Rome itself could fall, nothing was safe. The sack of 410 was just the beginning. The floodgates were open, 4-6, with the Rhine frontier stripped of troops. A massive wave of Vandals, Alans, and Swabi crossed the frozen river into Gaul. The Vandals, in particular, proved to be a dire threat. They rampaged through Spain and, in 429, crossed into North Africa, the breadbasket of the Western Empire. Their conquest of this vital province, culminating in the capture of Carthage, was perhaps an even more crippling blow than the sack of Rome. It deprived the empire of its main source of grain and a huge chunk of its tax revenue. Meanwhile, the Huns returned under their infamous leader, Attila. In 451, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, combined Roman and Visigothic army, led by the last great Roman general, Idias, fought Attila to a bloody standstill. It was a tactical victory, but it came at a terrible cost. Idias, like Stilicho before him, would not be rewarded. In 454, he was murdered by the suspicious Emperor Valentinian III. And again, the murder of a competent general had immediate, disastrous consequences. The very next year, in 455, the Vandal king Gazric sailed from Carthage and subjected Rome to a second, far more destructive attack, methodically stripping the city of its wealth over 2 weeks. The final act was now little more than a formality. The Western Roman emperor held no real power. Authority had fragmented into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms on former Roman soil. In 476 AD, this farce reached its conclusion. The last emperor was a young boy, ironically named Romulus Augustulus. His father, the general Orestes, had refused a demand for land from his mercenary soldiers. The troops mutinied under their Germanic chieftain, Odoacer. Odoacer captured and executed Orestes. September 4th, 476, he marched into Ravenna and deposed the boy emperor. Odoacer didn't bother to name a successor. He simply sent the imperial symbols to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, signaling that a separate emperor in the West was no longer necessary. He took the title King of Italy, and the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. The fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a single event in 476. It was a process, a long, agonizing decline brought on by a perfect storm of crises. An economy crippled by hyperinflation and crushing taxes could no longer support the state. A political system mired in civil war and led by a succession of weak emperors offered no direction. And a military that was overstretched and underfunded could no longer defend its own borders. The symbolic end in 476 wasn't a fiery apocalypse, but a quiet fizzle. The last emperor wasn't a mighty Augustus, but a powerless boy sent into peaceful retirement. By then, the real power had long since shifted to Germanic kings. What had fallen was the central political structure of the West. But did Rome truly fall? In one sense, yes. The political unity of Western Europe was shattered. But in another, more profound sense, Rome never vanished. In the East, the Roman Empire would endure as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. And even in the fallen West, Rome's legacy was everywhere. The new kingdoms were built on its ruins. They adopted Roman law, administration, and the language. The Roman Catholic Church, based in the city of Rome, would become the dominant spiritual and cultural force in Europe for the next millennium. The story of Rome's fall is more than just ancient history. It's a timeless warning. It shows how even the mightiest civilizations can collapse under the weight of internal decay. It shows that economic stability, competent leadership, and social cohesion are essential pillars of survival. The work of giants did crumble, but its echoes shaped the world we inherit today, and its story will forever haunt and instruct the empires that have followed.